Alright, hello everyone. So today I wanted to talk to you about two classes of drugs. One are opiates and the other one are antacids. And so talking about opiates, a lot of it's on the slide here, but opium and the opiates that come from opium, they're actually derived from a natural product. Again, you can see a lot of these drugs that we talk about, they come from plants, and opium is no exception. Opium will come from this opium poppy, and this plant, you can isolate morphine from it, and morphine belongs to a group of painkillers called alkaloids, and that's because they have this basic nitrogen group to them. Colloquially, they're called narcotics. So a narcotic is any drug that is based on morphine. And narcotics have this strong pain-killing effect, and they do this by blocking receptors in the brain. Depending on how well the narcotic will enter into the brain will depend on its strength. And we'll see that all of the opiates that we'll discuss here are based on morphine, but when we start changing the functional groups on the morphine, we will see that they are much more readily absorbed through the blood-brain barrier, and therefore they're much more powerful. So when we look at morphine, here's the poppy plant, and here's the structure of morphine, and here is where we're going to start changing the functional groups of it to make it more or less powerful. And so here with morphine, we have the two hydroxyl groups. Now, there's a big part of this molecule that's nonpolar, so it can cross through the blood-brain barrier. Morphine can be administered orally, it can be administered intravenously, it can be, depending on how quickly you want it to take effect. I remember I had a kidney stone when I was about 15 years ago. I had a kidney stone. It was one of the most excruciating pain experiences I had of my life. And I was rushed to the hospital. I didn't know what was wrong with me. And that was the only time in my life when I had morphine administered to me in order to deal with the pain. And that was done intravenously. That was actually, it acted incredibly quick to relieve that pain. And so we could take morphine and we can alter it, and I'll show you what that looks like. If we were to do a different type of form of morphine like codeine, codeine is available with a prescription, and codeine is less powerful than morphine. Codeine is less readily absorbed. Once it enters your body, it's transformed into morphine, but the ability of your body to do that makes it less powerful because your body is not readily able to transform all of it into morphine. Morphine is generally reserved for hospital use or for people that are in extreme pain, and they're basically on what's known as palliative or hospice care. And when doctors talk about pain management, they generally talk about what level of painkillers do they need to give you to make you comfortable. And if somebody's on a palliative care or they are on hospice care, they're generally trying to make the patient more comfortable, so that as they pass away, their life is not, riddled with extreme pain. Now, if we take morphine and we alter it, the two hydroxyl groups, we alter them and we make them into ester groups here, this makes a much more powerful form of morphine called diamorphine, the street name known as heroin. And this drug is extremely powerful compared to morphine. It passes through the blood-brain barrier much more readily, and it has a much more intense effect. And really, heroin is not used therapeutically. It is used, unfortunately, recreationally, and people become very addicted to this. They develop a tolerance to it. They need to take more and more of this drug in order to, feel the same analgesic effect. And then they end up overdosing because they're taking such a high dosage of this. Now, what's really scary is there's an epidemic of heroin usage and narcotic usage in our country, but they're starting to actually lace heroin and other narcotics with something called fentanyl. And fentanyl is about, I think, 100 times more powerful than heroin, and it could kill you very, very quickly. But it's very cheap to manufacture. And so what ends up happening is heroin and other, prescription narcotics like codeine, they are laced with this very dangerous form when the drugs are made illegally and distributed illegally, like heroin or some prescription pills that are made illegally, and they can kill the user. So we'll read an article in class. If you obviously you've heard about Prince and his passing away, and he was taking a prescription painkiller that was a narcotic, and it was laced with fentanyl, and that is what killed him. And we'll talk about that and the dangers of that drug. Okay, so let's move on to a less morbid topic, antacids. And so antacids, they're used to neutralize stomach acid. Our acid produces hydrochloric acid, and the range of pH is between 1 and 3. Antacids that are what are known as fast-acting, that immediately neutralize the hydrochloric acid, are usually metal hydroxides, but can be some kind of carbonate or hydrogen carbonate, and those will be fast-acting. So you ate something that's giving you heartburn, you take some Tums, or you take some Mylanta, or some milk of magnesia, and it should neutralize the stomach acid quickly. But there's, that is good for like a quick fix. If you need to really manage your stomach acid, how much acid your stomach is producing, those have different classes of drugs. Those actually shut down the machinery inside your stomach that's producing the acid, and that would be a long-term solution. So here are some equations for the fast-acting ones. So this is a metal hydroxide, aluminum hydroxide. Here's a carbonate and a sodium carbonate. And this is showing you the molecular equations up top. They neutralize the stomach acid, and they produce the salt and water. In this case, with the carbonates, they also produce carbon dioxide. And these are the net ionic equations down below, showing the neutralization of the hydroxides with the stomach acid. Now look at these, and you'll see that aluminum hydroxide, we could also use magnesium hydroxide as well. But why wouldn't I use something like sodium hydroxide? Why wouldn't I use that? And we'll discuss that in class. Why do we need to use something like aluminum hydroxide and magnesium hydroxide compared to something like sodium hydroxide? Give that some thought as to why we would do that. So these are fast acting. You can buy these over the counter. You can go to Target or CVS and you can pick up any of these compounds, and they will, be effective at neutralizing acid quickly for, the occasional heartburn. But what if you're really suffering and you have something called acid reflux? Acid reflux is this chronic condition in which the acid is coming up through your esophagus. The esophagus is not equipped to deal with that type of pH. You feel this burning and discomfort. Your body's telling you something's wrong. If you expose yourself to this acid over and over again untreated, it could damage the esophagus to the point where it could change the cells into precancerous cells. You could have something called a Barrett's esophagus. So you need to treat this and treat it effectively. And so they do this using acid reducers. There's two acid reducers that are common. One is of the omeprazole group. There's omeprazole, which is commonly known as Prilosec. You can buy that over the counter. There's also isoomeprazole, which is known as Nexium. The only difference between omeprazole and isoomeprazole is this part of the molecule right here. You can see that dashed line. That means that it's heading into the page. That means that the 3D structure of it shows a CH2 group going back into the page. Omeprazole has it coming out of the page. Those are called stereoisomers. And believe it or not, that simple change, the positioning of where that CH2 group is, that completely affects the function of this. That makes it so that it either, functions as in one way or another. They both do the same thing, and they both bind to what's known as a hydrogen ion pump. And they shut it down, they inhibit it. And this will then reduce the amount of hydrogen ions, which are the source of the acid that are being pumped into the stomach. Now there's another class of acid reducers that do something similar called ranitidine. And ranitidine is commonly known over the counter as Zantac. You can find this in CVS too. And this is the structure of ranitidine. And ranitidine acts by blocking histamine and something called the H2 receptor, the histamine 2 receptor. And that histamine then, in turn, activates the hydrogen ion pump and causes there to be an increase in the amount of acid. So, this histamine will activate this pump here, this hydrogen pump, and cause more H+. If you have Zantac will block this, and it will reduce the amount of histamine being secreted. Alright, so my last video on this will be the antivirals, and talking about some prevention of diseases and some, again, antibacterial resistance. If I had to say, what would be a take-home message for all of these videos, really, it is that the structure of the medicine, the drug, it deeply affects its function and how it works. We see that with all of the opiates, how if you change those functional groups, it could either make them less powerful or more powerful. We see that, with penicillins, if you change the functional group, it could make the penicillin more effective at killing bacteria. We see that with the aspirins. If we change the aspirin to an ionic salt, then it will make it much more bioavailable. All right, thanks so much for watching.